St. Louis, October 10, 1926. World Series. Game 7, the final inning. 2 outs. The Cardinals were winning. Ruth came to the plate. He walked. He moved to first base. Everyone knew. The game was nearly over. The next batter was waiting. 1 hit was all they needed. Ruth stood there, waited on first base. Then he did something. Something nobody expected. He started running. Towards second base. A stolen base attempt. Babe Ruth. Final inning. 2 outs. With the series on the line. Why? That question has never been fully answered. Not by teammates. Not by managers. Not by historians. And perhaps not even by Ruth himself. To understand what Ruth did on that October afternoon, you need to understand what the 1926 World Series meant. Not just as a championship, as a statement. Ruth had come back from 1925 a different player. The collapse, the hospital, the suspension, the .245 batting average that had made the press write obituaries for a career that wasn't finished. He had spent the winter differently, had trained differently, had arrived at 1926 spring training lighter, sharper, more focused than the man who had stumbled through the previous season. The 1926 season validated everything the winter had promised. He hit .372, hit 47 home runs, drove in 150 runs. The Yankees won the American League pennant. And now they were in the World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals, playing a 7th game that would determine everything. This was the stage Ruth had been built for. The biggest moment, the largest audience, the highest stakes. This was where Babe Ruth was supposed to be untouchable. The Cardinals were not supposed to be here. They were managed by Rogers Hornsby, who was also their second baseman and one of the best hitters in the history of the National League. They had a pitching staff built around Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was 39 years old and had been purchased from the Chicago Cubs mid-season and who had already won 2 games in this series. Alexander had pitched a complete game the day before. Game 6. He had drunk heavily after the game. There were stories that he had been found asleep in the bullpen when the Cardinals called for him in Game 7's 7th inning, that he had walked to the mound not entirely certain of what inning it was. What happened after he arrived was not uncertain at all. He struck out Tony Lazzeri with the bases loaded to end the Yankees' most dangerous threat of the game. It was one of the most famous moments in World Series history, and then the Cardinals held on. Held on through the 8th. Held on through the beginning of the 9th. 2 outs, 1 inning left. Ruth came to the plate. The pitcher on the mound was Alexander, still out there, 39 years old, pitching his 2nd day in a row. Whatever was in his system from the night before, still present in some form that only he could measure. He threw to Ruth carefully. Ball. Ball again. The count moved toward Ruth. Alexander was not going to give him anything to hit. The calculation was visible to everyone watching. Walking Ruth put the tying run on base, but gave Alexander the chance to face the next batter, Bob Meisel, with the game still in hand. The walk came. Ruth stood on first base. Meisel came to the plate. Lou Gehrig was on deck. The Yankees had their best hitters coming up. The Cardinals had Alexander on the mound. The situation was desperate, but not without possibility. A hit by Meisel, maybe 2, and the inning was still alive. The World Series was still alive. Ruth on first base was the tying run. Ruth at the plate would have been the winning run. He needed to stay on first base. He needed to wait for Meisel to hit. He needed to do the thing that the situation demanded. Be patient. Be disciplined. Be the base runner, and let the hitter hit. Then Ruth ran. Not a delayed steal where the runner reads the pitcher and goes on the pitch. Not a hit and run where the manager has given the signal and the batter swings regardless. Ruth simply ran, on his own, without a signal, without instruction, without apparent calculation that anyone who was watching could later reconstruct into logic. He broke from first base towards second while Alexander was in his windup, and catcher Bob O'Farrell, who had been watching Ruth with the specific attention that catchers give to dangerous base runners in the late innings of close World Series games, received the pitch, turned, and threw to second base with the speed and accuracy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. The tag was applied. The umpire's hand went out. Out. World Series over. Cardinals win. The Yankees, who had come into the ninth inning trailing by 1 run with their best hitters coming up, watched their season end on a base-running decision by the most famous player in the world. Subscribe right now if you've ever watched someone make a decision that made no sense and couldn't look away. Hit like if you've been arguing about this moment since you first heard about it. And drop a comment. Why do you think Ruth ran? Because what he said afterward tells everything about who he was and nothing about why he did it. The reaction was immediate and total. The Cardinals celebrated. The Yankees stood in silence that had the specific quality of men who cannot process what they just watched. Ruth crossed the infield toward the dugout, and the expressions on his teammates' faces documented the range of responses available when the best player on your team has just ended the World Series with an inexplicable decision. Some looked away. Some looked at him directly. None of them said publicly what they were thinking privately. You don't say publicly what you're thinking privately about Babe Ruth in 1926. Not if you're a Yankee. Not if you understand what Ruth means to the franchise and to the sport and to every person sitting in that stadium. You process it quietly. You dress and you leave. You come back next year. The press was not bound by the same courtesy. The newspapers had the question that everyone was asking, and they asked it with the specific directness of sports journalism, in an era when the relationship between reporters and players was more personal and more unfiltered than what would come later. Why did Ruth run? Ruth answered the question. His answer was consistent across the interviews he gave in the hours and days that followed. He said he was trying to make something happen, that the team was down and needed a run, and he was going to try to get into scoring position. That he had taken a big lead and thought he could get there, and he went. The answer was honest in the way that Ruth's answers were usually honest. Straightforwardly, without elaborate rationalization. Without the constructed narrative that athletes develop when they have had time to think about what they should say. He tried to steal second base because he thought he could. He was wrong. The series ended. That was it. But the why that the press was really asking wasn't logistical. It was psychological. Why would Ruth, a man who had spent the summer rebuilding his reputation, who had returned from his worst season to have one of his best, who understood better than anyone what the World Series meant and what was at stake in the ninth inning of the seventh game, make a base-running decision that defied every principle of smart baseball at the worst possible moment? The answer that Ruth gave, "I was trying to make something happen," is both true and incomplete. Because what Ruth was, at the deepest level, was a man who acted, who moved, who could not, even in the most high-stakes moment of the most important game of the year, be the man who stood and waited and let things happen around him. The manager had not told him to run. The situation had not called for a stolen base attempt. But something in Ruth's nature, the same thing that had made him great, and the same thing that had made him impossible to manage, and the same thing that had produced the career that nobody else in baseball history had produced, said run. And so he ran. Rogers Hornsby was asked about it years later. The Cardinals manager who had watched the play from the dugout with the specific relief of a man who has just been handed a championship by the other team's best player. Hornsby said he couldn't believe it when Ruth broke. Said every person in the stadium could see that O'Farrell was going to throw him out. Said Ruth's lead wasn't big enough, and his jump wasn't good enough, and the throw was going to be there before he was. Said he thought for a moment that maybe Ruth had gotten a signal he hadn't seen. Then the throw came. The tag was applied. Hornsby said he understood then that there had been no signal, that Ruth had simply decided to run. And Hornsby, who was one of the most analytical baseball minds of his generation, said he spent years trying to understand what Ruth had been thinking, never fully succeeded, which was, in the end, the most honest thing that could be said about the moment. Babe Ruth ran because Babe Ruth ran. Because he was the kind of man who ran. Because standing still, even in the ninth inning of the seventh game of the World Series, was not a thing that Ruth's nature allowed for very long. He was wrong to run. He knew it before he reached second base. The tag and the umpire's hand told him what his legs had already calculated as he ran. He was out. The series was over. And Babe Ruth, who had come back from everything that 1925 had done to him, walked off the field in St. Louis, having ended the World Series in a way that nobody who watched it would ever entirely explain. The Yankees came back. They always came back. The 1927 season arrived, and Ruth hit 60 home runs, and the Yankees won the World Series, and the 1926 stolen base attempt became a footnote to a larger story. A strange footnote, an inexplicable footnote, the kind that historians return to, not because it changed everything, but because it reveals something. About Ruth specifically. About the way certain kinds of greatness coexist with certain kinds of recklessness. About how the same quality that drives a man to do things nobody else can do also drives him, in the wrong moment, to do things nobody else would attempt. Ruth was wrong to run. He knew it. Everyone knew it. And yet in the knowing, in the absolute clarity of the error, there was also something that was unmistakably, recognizably, completely Babe Ruth. He saw something he wanted. He ran toward it. The throw beat him. He was out. Some stories about great men are about their greatness. This one is about the thing underneath the greatness. The thing that made the greatness possible, and the thing that, on one October afternoon in St. Louis, made a World Series end before it should have.